The beautiful Magandia was offered in marriage to the Buddha, but he rejected her. After the Buddha's sermon on the filthiness of the human body, Magandia became his sworn enemy, while her parents became anagamis. Later, King Udena appointed Magandia as one of his chief consorts. With wealth and power in her hands, Magandia was poised to exact her revenge on the Buddha and his disciples. Magandia's plan to frame Queen Samavati for the treasonous crime of regicide had failed, as did her scheme to discredit the Buddha and his monks by spreading wicked rumors. Even her plan to sow discord between the king and the virtuous queen over stewing chickens proved unsuccessful. For her fourth plan, Magandia had her servants remove the venom sacs from a snake. Knowing that the king would spend the next week at Queen Samavati's palace, Magandia then had her servants place the snake in the king's lute and cover the hole with flowers. The snake was left unfed and unable to escape. Then, on the day the king was to be with Queen Samavati, Magandia pretended to have had a bad dream that foretold the king's life being in danger and pleaded with him not to go. The king told her that she was crazy and that Queen Samavati loved him and would never hurt him. Magandia refused to relent and begged him to reconsider. She accompanied him all the way to Queen Samavati's room. Once in the room, Magandia pretended to inspect the room for danger. While the king had his back turned, she removed the flowers covering the hole of the lute and allowed the snake to slither out onto the bed. Magandia screamed and pointed to the snake fully coiled and raised up on the bed. Magandia grabbed the king and stood in front of him as if to protect him. All evidence seemed to point to Queen Samavati. The king lost his composure. All of Magandia's plans had succeeded in swaying his perception of his faithful queen. He commanded that Samavati and all her servant girls stand in a line so that he could execute them all for treachery. Samavati calmly stood in front of all of her maids. The king grabbed his bow and dipped the arrow tips in poison, meaning to kill every single one of them. Fuming with rage, he drew back his bow. Samavati stood by her innocence. She closed her eyes and made an aspiration. With all the devas and spirits as my witness, if I have ever had an evil thought towards the king or owe him my life through any karmic debts, may the arrow strike me through the heart. If I have not, may my honesty and virtue protect me and my maids. Samavati, being a Sotapanna, understood how karma worked. If she had committed past karmic crimes against the king, whether in this life or another, she would have to pay for it no matter what. If she hadn't, which she was at least certain she hadn't in this life, she would not be killed by him. She understood that karma is undeniable and futile to resist. Since we have already created the cause, we must accept the result. Queen Samavati also felt overwhelming empathy for the king. She was concerned with how much he would suffer after he regained his mindfulness. He would not be able to live with what he was about to do. Her good karmic past and present actions, her mindfulness, her compassion, and her steadfast belief in the Buddha would serve as her refuge. The king, unable to see through his rage, let the poison-tipped arrow fly. Mid-air, the arrow turned around and flew straight at the king. The king was stunned, frozen with fear. However, the arrow landed harmlessly at his feet. This miracle helped the king regain his mindfulness. He fell to his knees and begged Queen Samavati for her forgiveness, which she gave immediately and magnanimously. This only cemented what the king already knew, that Samavati was noble and virtuous. The king reflected on what had just transpired. His anger had almost caused him to kill the person he held most precious, the person who had always served him faithfully and with love. He imagined the regret and guilt he would have felt if he had actually killed Queen Samavati. He felt ashamed that he allowed his passion and anger to cloud his judgment. He felt ashamed that even though he was the king of a great country with many subjects, he had acted like a petulant child. Truly seeing and experiencing the harm caused by his anger, the king resolved to practice the teachings of the Buddha to try to control, understand, and eventually eliminate his strong emotions. The king asked Samavati what gift she would have from him to allow him to assuage his guilt. Queen Samavati asked for permission to give alms to the Buddha and his Sangha every day. The king was delighted and went to the Jetavana monastery himself to invite the Buddha and his monks to receive alms at the palace. However, instead of going to the palace himself, the Buddha sent the Venerable Ananda instead. Every day, the king, Samavati, and her maidservants gave alms and listened to the Dhamma. Every day, they focused, contemplated, and practiced. Thus, Magandiya's fourth plan failed, just as the others did. However, her hatred knew no bounds, and she was not ready to throw in the towel. Magandiya gathered all of her relatives, and together they plotted her revenge on Samavati and the Buddha. Ultimately, they came up with Magandiya's final scheme. First, Magandiya publicly left town. Then, her relatives locked all the doors, windows, and exits of Samavati's quarters. Finally, they set fire to the building while Samavati and all her maidservants were inside. The maidservants saw the fire and smoke and frantically tried to escape. When they discovered that all the exits were blocked, they realized that this was no ordinary fire, but one that was purposely set. They began to panic. When Samavati realized that there was no way out, she understood and accepted her fate. She gathered all of her maidservants into the room, and she sat in the center of the circle. Samavati coached the maids to spend what little time they had left contemplating impermanence, suffering, and our lack of control in this world and in life. Samavati's last words were, "It would not be an easy matter, even with the knowledge of a Buddha, to determine exactly the number of times our bodies have thus been burned with fire, as we have passed from birth to birth in the round of existences which has no conceivable beginning. Therefore, be heedful." The fear of impending death served to hone their focus. They kept contemplating until their final breath. All of the people in the room died, but not before achieving various levels of enlightenment. Later on, when the Buddha was asked about it, he confirmed that the women had become Sotapannas, Sakadagamis, Anagamis, and even Arahants before they died. When the king heard about the fire and that his beloved and precious Samavati was trapped inside, his first instinct was to rush inside the building. Upon further thought, he realized that this fire was highly suspicious and noticed one key person was conveniently missing from the scene of the crime: Magandia. The king knew deep in his heart that this was the handiwork of Magandia. He wanted to send his soldiers to execute her outright, but he did not have definitive proof that it was she who was behind the fire. Therefore, he devised a plan to lure the snake out of her hole. The king loudly proclaimed how grateful he was that he was finally rid of the pesky Samavati. She had long annoyed him with her fake graciousness and pompous kindness. Oh, how he wanted to reward the person or persons who had freed him from this burden. Right away, one of Magandia's servant girls rushed to tell her mistress. After receiving the good news that her plan was successful, Magandia was even further amazed that the king wanted to reward her. She returned to the palace and proudly declared that it was she who saved the king from that wretch of a queen. The king thanked her and announced that he would reward her grandly. The king asked Magandia to gather all of her relatives in her personal palace. He would thank them with a lavish celebration, complete with food, wine, and gifts. Magandia eagerly brought all of her relatives together and awaited the king. Some unscrupulous cheaters bribed their way into the royal ceremony, pretending to be Magandia's family. They were hoping to share in the results of others' actions. When all of Magandia's relatives were assembled, along with the reward chasers posing as her kin, they were publicly tortured and killed. Magandia endured further torture before being executed and reborn in hell, where she would remain for an incalculable period. When news of Samavati's death reached the monks, many wondered why those who had attained various stages of enlightenment had died in such a violent manner. The Buddha explained that this was due to karma created in a past life. In a past life, Samavati had been queen of Benares. She went with her ladies-in-waiting to bathe, and feeling cold, she asked that a bush be burned to give warmth. She saw too late that a monk, a Pancheka Buddha, a silent non-teaching Buddha, was sitting immobile within the bush. He was not harmed, since Buddhas cannot be killed. The women, however, did not know this and began to freak out. They were worried that they would be blamed for the death of a monk and it would make their lives difficult. Queen Samavati then had the evil idea to pour oil over the monk to completely kill him and burn away any evidence of their crime. The plan could not succeed, but their attempt granted them immense evil karma that they would have to pay. So, in trying to cover up their mistake, they replaced it with a much harsher one that they would have to pay for in kind.
What do you think the moral of this story is?
We hope you enjoyed the video. Click like if you did, and click subscribe if you want to see our uploads.